Okay. Good morning and welcome to Ways and Means. Time being shortly after 10 by 3 minutes. I'd like to open the public hearing on Senate Bill 291 and recognize Senator Lang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. I'm Senator Tim Lang. I am the senator for District 2, which covers the Lakes region and North. I am here to introduce for Senator Abbas, Senate Bill 291, relative to religious land use and property tax exemption. So I'm not going to detail what's in the bill other than to say that the reason this bill was originally brought forward was apparently, and this is not my area of expertise, but apparently there were former parsonages and parish houses where in the past reverends and priests would live in when they were assigned to a church. However, apparently nowadays parishes, priests and reverends get their own house and they don't tend to live on the property anymore, which left these houses empty. And so churches and stuff were starting to use some of their staff to fill the house, the parsonage. They would use it to allow the part-time secretary that worked or the bookkeeper to live in the parsonage. In some towns, based on the strict reading of the law, where it says if the pastor was living there, it was tax exempt. If anybody else was living there, it's not tax exempt. And therefore, they started taxing some of these parsonages across the state. And so the bill and speaking with the sponsor was, again, the intent was not to allow, for lack of a better phrase, a commercial rental unit, but to allow the church to continue its works through, like, again, the part-time secretary is probably making not much money. Giving them a place to live is an act of kindness and an act of taking care of the poor. To allow these churches to be able to continue to use their properties to advance their missions. And so in the conversation as we went through it, we discussed the idea of a church also using the parsonage. Maybe they do a congregate living setting where they have people who are, trying to, get free of addiction, whether it's, outright substance abuse due to opioids or fentanyl or alcohol, and giving them the ability to use these parsonages for that as well. And again, that, in my opinion, is a continuation of their mission. They're taking care of the sick. I think we'd all agree that someone suffering from addiction is sick. They have a problem. They need to get it resolved, and it's affecting their life. And so it's not, it wouldn't be out of the realm of the church's mission to support those services and support the sick and help them get healthy. So that's why the Senate amended the bill, and the initial bill, to allow those houses to be used for things like congregate living, and still maintain their tax exempt status because they are, again, continuing the church's mission, which is what the statute was intended for. That's a short version of the bill.
Are you open to questions?
Absolutely.
Representative Almy.
Thank you. What happens when you have a housing trust, which is housing a very large number of people that cannot afford to live in that region without it, which is not religious?
I'm sorry, Representative. I missed your first part of the question. What happens when? And I missed that.
The assessor is assessing those buildings for purposes of the property tax in that town.
And I'm sorry, your question is what? The tax collector can still do their work.
Are they treated differently than the religious organizations that would now be allowed to do the same thing?
Again, so the question is whether property who's being used for the purposes of the mission of the church, that's owned by the church. Mm-hmm. And I'd argue that structure in and of itself is what makes it tax exempt.
Mm-hmm. So in the case...
I'll also note that, again, in the second half of the bill, we did make sure that, again, this doesn't supersede reasonable zoning laws. So you'll see in section part 2 of the bill, right? However, such land and structures may be subject to objective and defined regulations concerning the height of the structures, the yard sizes, the lot sizes, the setbacks, the open space, the building coverage requirements, and compliance with DES concerns. So again, we're not outright exempting them from all rules just because they're a church. We're putting reasonable restrictions on them, but allowing them to do their mission.
I still don't understand what is the public building, the public, the land trust, which is a nonprofit, but I believe that they are required to pay property taxes, and that the towns would be pretty upset if they weren't, on the buildings that they build for purposes of low-income housing.
So again, thank you for the question. What the question is, are they pursuing their religious mission using the assets that they own? And my argument again is that the church is pursuing its religious mission.
So you don't know whether there's a discrimination here between religion and non-religion.
I answered your question, Representative.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on Representative Almy. So if you had well, as is frequent with the Catholic churches right now, you've got several churches that have been combined. The churches are still serving the church function for services, but the parish houses have been combined, or a priest travels from one to several others. In Hudson, the former parish house is used for a home for unwed mothers, and the former attached convent is now used for religious education purposes. So both of those would be covered as being following the mission of that particular church. Whereas if the former convent was converted into apartments for rental, that would not be covered.
Correct.
That's your interpretation of what this says.
Correct.
Does that answer your question, Representative Almy? And of course,
I'm going to need
if
to
a
talk
business
to my
was operated
assessor
out of it.
again.
Yeah. Any other, all right, we'll just go down the line. Representative Elberger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. I want to follow up on this on line 9 of the first part. Housing used for religious purposes includes up to 6 residential housing units or congregate housing units to be used for residential purposes or both. Who is going to be living in these congregate housing units, and to what religious purpose?
Sure. Thank you. I think I used my argument about substance abuse disorder, that it would be okay for a church to repurpose their parish or the parsonage to be able to do a substance abuse program, because I think we all agree that, again, someone who's suffering from addiction has a sickness, they have a problem. And if the church is helping them overcome their sickness or their problem, then that would be a function of their religion.
Follow up? What kind of guarantee is there in this bill that those congregate housing units, those residential units, will only be used for those purposes and not simply to rent out to raise funds?
Sure. The question is, do I think churches will lie? And I don't think they will.
Thank you.
Next in line, Representative Opel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have a couple of questions. Let me just follow up on Representative Elberger's question, though. The way the bill is currently presented to us, it strikes me that it would not require a lie for a church to say, we are going to rent out 6 apartments for the religious purpose of raising money for our church, to help sustain our church, to pay our priest or our pastor, to pay for choir training or religious education or whatever. That's not a lie, and it seems to me it's a justifiable religious purpose, but it, I think, gets away from the intent of the sponsors. Yeah, maybe I'm wrong.
Thank you. If I remember right, and I'm trying to remember back, not-for-profits and churches have to file what's called a 12A form every year in order to maintain their exemption status, and they would have to write what the purpose of what the property is being used for. Then the town gets to make this call. If they decide that it's just commercial rental property, they can tax it, and the church can challenge it. So again, when they fill out that 12A form that's required for property tax exemption, that's the document that they'd either tell the truth or lie on. If they tell the truth and the town disagrees, then they have the right to challenge it.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Follow up.
I will say, Senator, I'm somewhat sympathetic to this because in my own town, there was a church that had an apartment attached to it, and the pastor had another house, and they wanted to rent it to the choir director, and the contracted assessor read the current law and said, that's not permissible. You're going to be taxed for it. So I've seen this situation, but I'm following up on the chairman's point. I'm wondering, as I read, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at the bill online and it doesn't have the line numbers, but as I read the opening paragraphs, it says, goes through the list of who and what should be available for this exemption, but it also includes the words on the same lot.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if in fact, for example, in my community, the Catholic Church is now combined a church in Canaan, a church in Enfield, along with the church in Lebanon. If there's a parsonage in Canaan, it's not on the same lot as the church, either in Canaan or in Lebanon. And so I'm just, does that on the same lot create an issue? For example, if you have a church, but on a different lot, you had the parsonage. And I guess, again, thinking my own community, the Methodist Church has a parsonage that is clearly not on the same lot. If they were going to rent that out for an addiction program or a religious education program, would that language trip them up?
So thank you for the question. I don't believe so. When we actually talked about that issue, the intent of making that language was you couldn't rent the house next to the church, that the church didn't own the property and then put something in there, then call it tax exempt. That's what the intent, I think the intent was it has to be on a lot that is owned by the church.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow up on that question. So when you're talking about on the lot, I'm thinking of Merrimack, where the parsonage is about a half a mile away from the church in South Merrimack, or it's Catholic. So when you're talking about the lot, it's the lot owned by the church, and that can be one of several lots.
Correct. That was the reading of it was.
Did you get that? All right, thank you. Next. Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. I'll make this quick. Okay. Since it looks like we're expanding the exemptions, do you see an increase for the property tax owners in cities or towns going up because of these enlarged exemptions that maybe we're looking at?
So again, I don't think this enlarges. I think that these properties are already mostly tax exempt now. It's the interpretation of what happens next, right? And so again, I don't think this changes the outcome. It doesn't raise property taxes. I think it clarifies, this bill clarifies what those properties can be used for to make it clear that the exempt property can still maintain its exemption status.
And next, Representative Spar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The line 9 says housing used for religious purposes includes up to six residential housing units. Excuse me. Why not just say includes residential housing units? Why do we limit it to 6? Why? Where was that figure coming
Sure.
from? Do you have any idea?
Yeah. So again, that was my request when I amended the bill, and the idea was we didn't want churches to also turn into commercial renters, right? We wanted to keep it contained and not have it so that they own 10 acres of land, they can go throw a 20-unit apartment in the back of their land and call it tax exempt and start renting properties out. So the intent was to allow the use, but constrain the use as well.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Follow up.
From reading the RSA and this bill too, which is part of that, the existing language and what the courts have said, there has to be a religious purpose to the use of those buildings, residential or whatever, the parsonages or the church itself. If they're renting it out to for non-religious purposes, then it would be violated under the from what I understand the court decisions have been.
Understood. Again, the issue, I think, I can't remember who was it, reference to having just renting it out to support the mission of the church, and they could argue that there was reprobable, and it was again a idea of constricting that and constraining that, so that wasn't the case.
Representing Spar, I believe somebody's going to be speaking directly to the legal aspects of this. Representative Orrs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could I defer to Representative Bolton? He's been patiently waiting over there. And then
I said it was going to go around the but yes, if you wish, turn off your light. Representative Bolton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And unfortunately, I did meet Representative Schamberg, who ended up addressing my concern of the property value of this may actually increase the property values in the town of Plymouth, where I live. 37% of the town supports all the nonprofits that occupy the town. And I think this might add even a little bit to that. And I'm thinking there's nothing wrong with the intent of the law, but I think there should be some funding mechanism that would provide towns monies that would offset the increased value or of rental property, perhaps. Would you agree?
So again, these are already tax exempt structures. That's all I can say is we're not taking anything off the tax rolls and now that currently has exemption. The problem is again the interpretation of some town assessors that they're doing just the opposite, taking exempt property and putting it back on the tax rolls because the secretary lives there, not the pastor. And the intent is to fix that and to clarify that.
Now, Representative Orsi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your generosity knows no bounds. Thank you. So, thank you, Senator, for taking my question. So, historically speaking, what has been the mission of the church for the last couple thousand years?
Well, it depends on your religion, but I always say that the shortest way to most religions are love, right? So you can say it how you want. It has all other ways of saying it, but it's taking care of the poor, taking care of the sick, showing kindness, right? So those are all missions of the church in almost everyone, but the short answer is love.
Thank you. Follow up. So as you said earlier, I think the sick would include those that are addicted and so on and so forth. So in your opinion, if the church is predominantly a traditional church or it flies a gay pride flag, but they're doing the work of taking care of the addiction, feeding the poor, do you have a problem with that either way?
None whatsoever.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Representative Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. Where did number 6 come up with residential units? And what happens if somebody has more than 6 residential? You're smiling. You've heard this, right?
So again, we were talking, that mainly came around the congregate living setting. How big do we want them allowed to have these programs that were in there? So the idea of 6 units or congregate housing units was, again, I could have 6 bedrooms in a place and have 6 people living there doing a substance abuse disorder program. But we didn't, again, want it to grow so big and so large that they should look at other ways of doing it, because we start running into problems with zoning, in all fairness, right? So the community all of a sudden has 30 people living in a house, right? Could be problematic for a given community. So we're trying to find a reasonable number that would allow the smaller churches that have parsonages would be able to use the building for a function.
Senator, okay. To follow up on Representative Cole's comments, how would this bill, with the limitation of 6, apply to the Benedictine Center in Winchester, which has, I think, something like 25 people living in a dormitory there, or St. Anselm, with, I think they got 50 or so monks residential, not in the church, but in the monastery.
So thank you for the question. Again, I think that they would not be subject to this again because they're actually religious, for lack of a better phrase, employees. They're religious. They're the pastors, which is what the intent of this was, of the nuns, and that was the intent of what this was, so the original law. So I don't think it'll be impacted, but if you do, be open to an amendment to correct it.
Well, the nuns are across the street on St. Anselm Drive. All right, thank you. Representative Ohm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question on the congregate housing topic. Is there a definition for congregate housing that would say capacity per square foot or some definition? Or can this be indeed a dormitory with triple bunks and as many people as you can pack in?
So thank you for the question. Again, there is a definition. It's in federal law and state law. We have one. I forgot to print it out, but we do have one.
Yeah, if we could get that for reference. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you, if you know what that is, could you tell our researcher so she can get it? Thank you, sir. Are there any other questions? Representative Opel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for indulging me. And Senator, thank you as well. Just looking at the section we've been talking about, 6 units congregate housing, am I correct in reading that where it says up to 6 residential housing units or congregate housing units to be used for residential purposes or both, which I'm reading to say that you could have 6 residential units and congregate housing on the same lot? Is that?
So I don't think that was the intent. The intent was,
I'm just trying to figure out
Yeah,
the or
again,
both,
so
what
you
that
can-
refers back
in a
to.
congregate living setting, you generally have shared resources, shared bathrooms, shared kitchen, that kind of thing, right? In a residential unit, it may be self-contained studio apartments, right? But the intent is you can only have 6 of those combined.
Okay, I'm just, sorry, I was an English teacher. Or both. that parenthetical phrase is
Right.
throwing me.
Well, again,
I'm
I
not
think
sure
the
what-
intent was I could have one residential unit for the person who's running the actual program, the substance abuse program, and he's got his own studio apartment. But then I could have 5 other bedrooms that would be congregate living setting, and combined they would count to 6.
Okay. Okay. One more follow-up, just quickly. And then the phrase, I understand that this applies to properties that as of January 1st, 2025, which would be last January, correct?
Correct.
And then it says, or owned for a period of not less than 5 years. So I can only assume that means, should they choose to start an addiction program, for example, that they could buy property, hold it for 5 years, and then it would become under this provision.
Correct.
Is that?
But that's my interpretation of that piece of the statute.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other questions? Hearing none. Thank you very much, Senator Lang. Representative Pearson, looking forward to your input.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, State Representative Mark Pearson. I've been in the House 9 years, but more relevant to the point, I've been an active clergyman for 50 years. I want to speak to just one point in the bill, and that is lines 3 and 4, which speak about church parsonages occupied by their pastors or designated church employees. Traditionally, the parsonage, vicarage, rectory was occupied by the minister, priest, rabbi. Over the last several decades, however, many members of the clergy have decided they wanted to own their own home. They didn't want the church or synagogue committee traipsing through it periodically, and they certainly wanted equity in a residence when they retired. As a result, religious organizations set up what was called a housing allowance. The church would give a certain amount of money to the clergy member who could spend it as he or she wishes. Now, you may say, wow, that's going to hurt the town because you've got the parsonage still there not being taxed, and now you've got another property not being taxed. When a housing allowance goes to a clergy member to buy his or her own house, that property is taxed. I pay $11,000 a year to the town of Hampstead because I have a housing allowance, but I also own my own house. So if you looked at lines 3 and 4 and talked about pastors or designated church employees, here's my point. This is not taking property off the local town's real estate tax roll. That alternate dwelling for the clergy member is being taxed. That's the only point I wish to make on this.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Representative Boris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So historically speaking, thanks for taking my question, Representative. Have the churches been taxed?
Historically, no.
Thank you.
And this has been brought to trial on numbers of occasions in different states under the idea that this is the establishment of religion clause talked about state churches like the Roman Catholic Church of France or the Church of England, helping a church do its mission, which often has great benefit to the town, was not considered an establishment of religion. Therefore, no real estate tax.
Any other questions? I just have one. Your reading of this bill then is that a parsonage specifically purchased by the leader of a congregation of whatever type would be subject to taxation if, or even though there was a parsonage attached to the church or owned by the church.
No.
But you're saying separate from that, if the leader of the congregation decided to buy a house for his own investment purposes, basically either on his own salary or because the money you receive as a housing allowance is a 1099 reportable income. Is that your position?
I missed the first part of it, but if the clergy member chose to stay in the church supplied house, that's what he gets for his dwelling, and it is not real estate taxable. If the clergy member chooses to take the housing allowance to rent an apartment, buy a house, do whatever, the parsonage, now vacated by the clergy member, is still tax exempt. You can put another staff member in there, but it doesn't cause the town to lose additional money because that other place bought by the housing allowance is subject to real estate tax. If not, I want $11,000 times 23 years back.
Yeah, well, that's Hampstead. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Any further questions? Thank you, sir. I think I'll call Nick Taylor, please. Oh, I didn't realize there was an audience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Nick Taylor. I'm the director of Housing Action New Hampshire. We're a statewide advocacy organization that works on pro-housing policy. We are here in support of this bill today. And to provide a little bit of background, the conversation around using religious structures and religious land for housing is one that is going on around the country. There are bills in Florida and Texas, Washington State, other places to take a look at this, largely driven by that conversation of needing to increase the supply of housing and the affordability of it. And, when we think about the affordability, we always talk about this in the context of sort of 5 L's that go into affordability. There's labor, lumber, lending, laws, and land. And so this is pulling one of those levers of land because religious institutions have existing land that they could better utilize potentially for housing that is going to be more affordable because you're taking a big cost driver off of the equation. when we think about that. And so, as Senator Lang mentioned, this bill has changed a little bit during the amendment process. Originally, there was no limit. That 6-unit limit that Representative Cole brought up was not there. There was unlimited density essentially within the structure of sort of the other height and setbacks and other pieces that are within local zoning. The Senate committee pulled that back to 6 units. So this is a pretty modest expansion of sort of the existing law around a pastor or a priest or someone being able to live on the structure, expands it to be able to include additional staff, other members of the community, or as we talked about, the congregate housing piece. So we would actually support this going further and allowing for more affordable options on these properties. But here we think it is a fairly modest change, but one that will help on the margins when we're looking for more attainable housing options within our community and using existing structures that aren't sprawling us out into some of the open spaces and other parts of our community. You're taking the buildings, you're being able to better utilize it within the general mission of what the religious institution is trying to accomplish. So we support the bill and happy to answer any questions to the best of our ability.
Are there any questions, Representative Opal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Taylor, I want to clarify something. I thought Senator Lang very specifically said this would not be for commercial, residential, rental property, that this is not about expanding the housing stock beyond religious employees, people associated with the particular church building. As I listened to you, you talked about providing housing for people in the community. That was not the sense I got from Senator Lang, but is that your sense of this bill?
Happy to be corrected, but my understanding is with the residential units definition that you are talking about homes for people in the community, not necessarily limited solely to church employees, but happy to be corrected by other folks behind me. And I know in other states where this has been looked at, it is not trying to solely limit it just to employees of a church.
Well, just follow up, Mr. Chairman. I thought what I heard Senator Lang, it could be beyond just the employees, but it would have to be for a very specific religious purpose, such as a substance abuse recovery program or something similar to that. It would not just be Thomas Opal can walk in off the street and rent an apartment from St. Michael's or St. Jordan's. I've always liked Eastern Europe, but that it was not sort of for any member of the community, that it had to be a very specific religious purpose.
I'm happy to be corrected by others who have worked on the bill in more detail. I know when we had original conversations about this bill at the start of session, there was the interest was in expanding it beyond just employees.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Almy.
Yes, I'd just like to remind you, I guess I have to ask you, that the reason we have all these limitations is that we have the worst property taxes in the country relative to our abilities. And if we expand housing for people that cannot really afford what is going on inside of our town, like in Lebanon, then and that is not taxed by the property tax, then everybody else's property taxes go up, and a number of people who are living in their houses but can't afford anything more have to leave.
Thank you for the question. I think part of the intent here was by limiting on that same lot, that this was not a situation where a religious institution could buy up land all over town and turn it into exempt housing, but you're taking sort of existing land, existing structures, and modestly expanding it. But I appreciate the question.
Any follow-up? No. Representative Bolton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Taylor, regarding the, actually, when you were speaking about the benefit of having this, come to, reality, but there is which I just recalled, there's a Rumney Bible Conference in Rumney, and it's basically a large tract of land that houses both people within the Bible Conference itself, and also for other people that have just either bought into this or whatever. So I'm thinking that initially I wasn't too sympathetic with what you're going for, but it seems like something like this may already be a reality with this Bible Conference and the properties that they own. So are you familiar with that Bible Conference, or?
Appreciate the question. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay.
No.
Well, I'm going to have to take a look at that, actually. Would you agree that that would be a good use of the properties that, should there be like a large tract of land that is already being utilized by a Bible Conference or something similar?
Yeah, it certainly seems interesting to me. I'll also take a look, and appreciate you bringing it up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Orrs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for taking my question. So it sounds to me like you and Representative Opa are saying basically the same thing. You've used the terminology several times that the intent is to the properties for staff, whatever, and then this commercial play comes into being. But my understanding is there is no intent for a commercial play in any way or form in this manner. It's for people that are in need, whether it's addiction or whatever it might be. I mean, do you think there's any intent that this would be a pure commercial play, as in I may want to walk up and rent this property myself?
I think commercial in the sense of like retail or not housing, certainly not. This is specifically to housing. So commercial in sense of retail or office space or anything like that, absolutely not. I think in terms of the market rate piece, is that what you're like, just a general residential unit on the market? Is that
So, yeah, so I absolutely agree with what you just said. But what I'm saying is the property, there's no intent in this bill to allow that property to be used for anybody to come in off the street and say, well, I want to rent it, and you have to rent it to me. Would you agree with that? In other words, Representative Oppo could not come to St. Thomas or whatever the church is and say, well, I want to rent that property, although he has no addiction, no need. He's got plenty of money. We all know the guy's rich. And so we're not gonna let him come in and rent this property, are we? This is for people in need, period.
So I appreciate the question. I would have to let me look into and get back to you, because I don't want to go down the wrong path here on this, but I appreciate the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Elberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
Having heard that you may have misinterpreted the intent of this bill, that this housing would only be available for church-related or religious-related services and people who would stay there, does that change at all your support for it?
No, I don't think it would. We still face the shortage, and the same folks are struggling to find housing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Representative Opel.
If I could, since Representative Orrs raised my addiction or non-addiction, I just want to clarify. I very specifically asked Senator Lang if the scope of for religious purposes, which is very, specifically in the bill, that the housing must be used for religious purposes. And what I asked Senator Lang was, okay, if I'm a church pastor and I say we're going to rent out the 6 units of housing that we had for whatever, for a convent or a monastery, we're going to rent those out now at market rate to anybody in the public who comes in. and the religious purpose is to raise money for the church. And as I understood Senator Lang's answer, he said, no, that would not be permissible. His interpretation, that would not be permissible. So I just want to, what I heard you say was, I
think we're getting into a little bit of argumentation here, and
okay, I just want to clarify that point because I think it's critically important to this bill.
yes.
I agree. And we will do some follow-up work and make sure we get you a correct answer, because I think it's a very fair
And
question.
It looks like there's several questions that need to be resolved, so I think we know where that's going to go. And we've got a little bit of time to do that. Okay, any other questions? I thank you very much for
Thank you.
confusing us. Thank
We'll
you
see
very
if
much
someone
for your
behind me can
testimony.
help.
Appreciate it. Call Brody Deschamps. Deschamps. Excuse me, Brody. I'm sorry.
That's fine. You can just go by first name. It's okay. Brody Deshays. I represent the New Hampshire Municipal Association. I had shorter testimony, but I have a lot more to add based on some of the testimony you guys have heard. I'd like to clarify several points. My first point is going to be I'm surprised the bill was referred to this committee because it's a local tax revenue and this is a zoning bill. It's not just about property tax exemptions locally. There are aspects to zoning mandates and requirements locally, and I'm not sure how often the Ways and Means Committee reviews zoning mandates. You guys review a lot of zoning mandates? Oh, that's surprising. Usually those would get referred to House Housing or municipal and county government. The first thing is the definition of congregate or group living. That's defined locally in zoning ordinances. I know that question came up, so it really depends on the municipality, how they define it, the types of group living or congregate living situations that would fall under their definition, and what zones that's permitted in. Monasteries are already tax exempt, monasteries and convents, and that's, you can see in the language of the bill, existing language under RSA 72:23 Roman 3, convents and monasteries fall under that tax exempt status. This bill has two different types of housing that's going to be tax exempt. There's first the different parsonages occupied by, public houses of worship, church parsonages occupied by pastors or a designated church employee, and then all those other different religious, types of buildings and lands all on the same lot. So not only is it any church employee who lives in a housing unit, it's kind of unlimited for the church employees aspect, but it's also that lot of land, which currently the language is appertaining to them. So it'd be the parts of the land and the building appertaining to, under current law, the pastors or some other religious leader who's living in that housing. This bill expands it so then it's not just pastor. It can be any designated church employee, and there's no cap on the amount of housing for church employees, and there's no limitation on the land that is tax exempt. So it could be any of the land. And, we've had some examples from assessors, at least in two situations, where some of the land that isn't being used for the religious use appertaining to it, they might lease out space for telecommunications infrastructure, like, for example, a telephone, tower and things of that nature. So that's something where they're creating revenue. This would tax exempt that commercial uses that are on the property. Then there's also this different, tax exempt, this new types of residences, these residential programs, and specifically housing used for religious purposes. And religious purposes isn't really defined. So as some committee members have mentioned, very expansive how this could be interpreted. It could be difficult for municipalities to try to interpret whether or not it's truly a religious use. And this is capped at about 6 units. Right, so there's 6 units, and they could be rented to anybody in the public at market rate. And one could reasonably argue that the revenue derived from that might help further the religious purpose, because they might take that revenue from the housing they rent and put it towards some other program within their religious organization. So that's kind of, we have these two parts. You can see the first part is the existing law, lines 3 through 8, that then has these 2 different types of housing units. Which would be lines 3 through 4 is the one type that is kind of, for those religious employees. That's kind of infinite how much housing units could be tax exempt depending on how many employees you're housing. And then you have, the lines 5 and 6, where it's these, residential programs, and then residential programs that goes into further depth in the second section, lines 9 through 15, explaining that these are rental units and, you can only have 6 of that type of housing. I also want to flag the zoning mandate in section 2, lines 16 through 26. Our biggest concern with this section is that it really expands the types of religious properties that are exempt from several reasonable local zoning requirements, and would include a lot of this new housing. And you can see the specific on line 19, the specific term, including those listed in RSA 72:23, Roman 3. So that would mean all the housing that's listed on lines 3 through 15 of the bill. So again, these are, and specifically if you think about these housing used for religious purposes, these rental units, those 6 units would be exempt from the majority of local zoning. Our biggest concern too is site plan review, right? Site plan review in the municipalities where they're legislative bodies, the voters have adopted a site plan review. The local planning board or some person from the planning department will go and walk the site, and they'll determine whether or not there's adequate provision for fire safety, prevention and control, preventable elements of pollution such as noise, smoke, soot, particulates, or other discharge for the environment. Adequate drainage or conditions conducive to flooding of property or that of another, so in a butter, making sure the streets are sufficient width to accommodate existing and prospective traffic and to afford adequate light, air access for firefighting apparatus, equipment. I mean, there's sections, specifically in RSA 674:44, there has to be at least 25 lines of different things that you go through site plan review for to make sure a subdivision, which sees 6 units of tax-free, not really defined religious purposes, this type of housing would be exempt from, where every other person who's creating a 6-unit development, whether it's one multifamily dwelling or a 6-unit subdivision, they would be exempt, but these other developers, these other people who are using land in the same zoning district wouldn't be. I also want to point out that the effective date is pretty unworkable. The fact that the zoning mandate would take effect July 1st, 2025 would not afford municipalities the ability to go to town meeting and to get their zoning ordinances updated by the legislative body, the voters. I also just want to point out, as a matter of fact, to Rep. Almey's point, is that this would increase the tax burden onto the rest of the property taxpayers in the municipality. You would theoretically be taking potential property that could be taxed, property that would be increasing the tax base, and you would be exempting it, and the rest of the property owners would be picking up the slack. And again, for these 6 units of housing, there are going to be people who potentially could be living there who need their children to be educated in the public school system, who will depend on local public safety services like ambulance and fire and police. They'll need roads, plow, water, sewer. So again, you're exempting these structures who are going to be utilizing all the same services as their neighbors, yet they won't have to pay property taxes, or technically their landlord, the church, won't, but everyone else in the municipality will be paying for those services. So they'll be subsidizing that housing. So for all those reasons, that's why we're opposed to the bill as currently written. We've negotiated some drafts of potential amendments with Cornerstone Action, and I know Ian's here and he'll probably speak to the bill, but we'd be happy to work more on drafting an amendment to make this a little bit more workable. But kind of the whole concept is, we're against other property taxpayers subsidizing housing that's getting a tax exemption just because of the owner of it has some, is a religious organization. We're of the belief that everyone should have to pay their fair share. And I'll take any questions if there are any.
Just to begin with, you indicated that line 17 would remove all zoning restrictions on the property, yet lines 19 through 25 actually put the restrictions back in.
I said most zoning requirements would be limited or would not apply. And again, it says no zoning ordinance or site plan review, but then it says, however, that such land or structures may be subject to objective and definite regulations concerning the height of structures, yard sizes, lot area, setback, open space. So there's all these things listed. And so only zoning ordinances that are applied equally to all property owners, whether they're religious or not, that cover that long list of things listed on lines 20 through 23. would apply. So again, that would be like site plan review is completely exempt, and there would be several other requirements that are in local zoning that would be exempt. So unless it was clearly defined in the zoning ordinance and applied to everyone equally, it wouldn't apply. And these things, height, structures, yard sizes, those would be the only types of things that would apply in the zoning ordinance as long as it's applied equally.
Representative Orris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Excuse me. Thanks for taking my question. So you obviously want to raise the taxes. So are you getting a kickback? I mean, is there anything in this
Representative
bill that
Orris.
you like?
Representative Orris.
Yes, sir.
That's improper, sir.
Did I have my light on?
I don't know.
Is there anything in this bill you do like?
There we go.
Thank you. So thank you for the question. No, our organization does not get a
It was rhetorical. You don't need to answer.
quote. I would still
Well, then
like.
we won't have any further rhetorical questions, will we, members?
No.
Representative Spar, and then
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I just wanted to clarify. I wasn't sure whether I heard you correctly. Cell phone tower, you're saying under this bill, it would potentially be property tax exempt?
Potentially, yeah, because it says you'll see on lines, specifically line 5, the beginning of it, on the same lot. Our concern is, assessors have raised concerns that there would be different structures and things on the same lot that would also be considered under the tax exemption.
Okay. And just a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
yeah, but I have to comment on that because if you look at line 5 and 6, it talks about for religious purposes, and unless you have a dedicated cell tower for religious purposes, it's not. That's a non sequitur, sir. Yes, follow up, Representative Spar.
I think that may be accurate, Mr. Chair. I'd just be interested, you mentioned you've got a summary of these changes and or amendments, and would you please share them with us?
Yeah, I'll follow up with Cornerstone and see if they want
I
to.
think we should probably wait for a work session to get into the details of that because we do have another bill to hear today.
Not saying to share with us now, sir, just, before we have the work session, so we come in prepared.
Yes, that I'm sure that both Cornerstone and the Municipal Association will have something to add to that. Representative Almia.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that some of what you're talking about, I believe, is already in existing law
That
in
is
a number of places.
so. That is correct. RSA 674:76 is an existing law, but the way we currently interpret it is that it's for religious houses of worship. And it's not for this expansion of the definition of RSA 72:23 Roman 3, and that would be added to RSA 674:76. So it would expand that zoning mandate to all housing that's kind of owned by religious organizations, either the 6 units of housing used for, quote, religious purposes, end quote, or all the housing that pastors or designated church employees would reside in. That would be that would fall under RSA, at least in this bill, it would fall under RSA 674:76. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Who's next? Representative Malloy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. You mentioned earlier in your presentation, you were wondering why this is in front of Ways and Means. What committee in the House would you believe this should be in front of then? I understand, but
Yeah,
this is a question.
Yeah, my personal opinion would be either municipal and county government. I think that would be first and foremost because it's dealing with zoning and with local tax exemptions. I think it could also reasonably go to House Housing because it deals with a housing issue. Not to say that you guys aren't qualified to look, review this bill. I mean, obviously in the House rules, how you're defined, it kind of ends with, or and such matters as may be referred to it. So technically,
it was referred to us, therefore we have it.
correct. So, but
Thank you.
That would be
Thank
my
you for your
opinion.
answer. I agree.
Representative Elberg. And then
Oh,
No, it's not me.
Representative Opal.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Deshays, you may be the wrong person to answer this question, but are you aware of any definition in the statutes of religious purposes?
That's a great question, Representative, and thank you. That was a big thing when we discussed and kind of were, thinking of potential amendments. That's something that the municipal association would really like to have defined. What is religious purposes? What types of housing? And how do you verify that a religious purpose is, that the housing is being used for religious purpose? And how is, when it comes to assessing, the assessors are very black and white. They like to know exactly what's defined in the law, how exactly it's going to qualify, have local forms to make sure that they can fulfill these laws and local regulations, and make sure they can even go to the site and review and make sure that it actually is meeting tax exemptions as stated in the law or in any rules established by DRA. So currently on line 9, as you mentioned, housing used for, quote, religious purposes, end quote, that's very open-ended. It might be very unworkable for municipal assessors to determine what is, is this truly being used for religious purpose? And oftentimes you're going to have issues that will land in court in front of the BTLA, the Buildings Trust and Land Appeals Board, trying to figure out, is this truly a religious purpose? Currently, there's a lot of case law related to the term appertaining to them. And so it's actually very well established what types of land structures are appertaining to these religious housing or religious purposes. So we actually think that that term, because there's been such a long established case law for the last few decades, is a good term, and it's something where it's been pretty settled as to what are the lands and lots and different things that are appertaining to them that would qualify for this types of property tax exemption.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Almy, did you have a question?
I know my light just doesn't.
Let your light shine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Brody, for taking my question. So Senator Lang responded several times that the property could not be used just to raise funds for the church. Some of your arguments seem like you're assuming that that is what it's going to be used for, as far as still being exempt when it's raising money. So just for clarification, it might be worth it to kind of look into that before we have our work session.
Of course.
Because your approach was pretty different from Senator Lang's.
Thank you, Representative. And just to clarify, I mean, we can't speak to the intent of how a church will use the property or the revenue derived thereof from these rental units described in lines 9 through 15, but they could reasonably, under this bill, without a definition for religious purposes, it could be, yes, we're renting these units at market rate, and the reason is it's funding these different religious purposes. So, and that's part of the reason why when talking to Cornerstone and other stakeholders, we were like, there needs to be some kind of definition, because I don't think that's the intent of the bill. But I think that's the way it could be reasonably construed. And I wouldn't think, if this were to pass as law as currently written, I wouldn't find it unreasonable for a religious organization to make that argument.
Are there any further questions? Hearing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm called Danielle Pasek, City Solicitor of Concord.
Good morning. My name is Danielle Pasek. I am the city attorney for the city of Concord. Our city manager, Thomas Espel, did submit testimony. I think it was emailed to everybody. I do have a copy of the letter, but I did want to make myself available to answer any questions. I'm not going to rehash what we already wrote in the letter. I would note, though, just from sitting here this morning, there does appear to be a lot of questions about the interpretation of the bill as it is currently written. There are some ambiguities there. I think a lot of our letter was focused on the fact that we were concerned that this could be housing for secular purposes, not religious purposes. There's language in the proposed bill that talks about residential programs, which I think is vague. Is it residential programs for religious purposes, or is it all residential residential programs. If it's all residential programs, the concern is that if a church owns, for example, a nursing home or some other facility that it provides housing for elderly people, that could potentially take what is currently a taxable property off the tax rolls. And then the last comment I would make is that in terms of the parsonages being converted for designated employees, that's not what the bill currently says. It can be new construction that's built on the site. So this is not just current existing properties. The way it's written, it can be either new buildings on the existing site or properties purchased in the future. And that could be for designated employees, which is not clearly defined. And that 5-year requirement of owning it for 5 years would not apply. So a church, depending on what they're looking to do, could buy properties in the city or elsewhere in other municipalities and take potentially a significant amount of property off the tax rolls. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Just one quick question. Let's say that a church wanted to put up as is in my community, a home for unwed mothers or expectant mothers, support after birth, and they bought a house down the street. Would the church then be expected to pay taxes while providing a service to people in need?
Well, you're not going to like this answer, but it depends. For sometimes, if it's not a religious,
Are you an attorney?
I am, and we've done. Unfortunately, I've been involved in a fair amount of litigation over RSA 7223, both for charities and for religious organizations. And if it's a home for unwed mothers or unwed people, it would be really, I think, a charity. And so if they're looking for an exemption, if they're operating as a charity, they can apply. Even though it's a religious organization, they can apply for a charitable tax exemption. And if they are purely providing a charitable service, then it would be granted. But is it a religious purpose? I think that's a big question. Unless the mission of the church is specifically to deal with that situation, and that's critical and essential for the religious the church, then or whatever religious organization, it would not be a religious use.
All right, thank you very much. Representative Opal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Counselor, for taking my question. I actually have two. The first one is, are you aware, since you appear to have or have described yourself as having pretty extensive experience in this area, are you aware of any definition in state law or federal law of what a religious purpose is?
Really, it's up to the courts. We've dealt with it quite a bit, and typically I know our assessor looks at it broadly. So they always give a religious organization the benefit of the doubt. If it's a building used, for example, if there's storage, that's going to be a religious purpose. We've had vacant land where there's trails and it's used by the congregation, and that's a religious purpose. But if they own a large chunk of vacant land that's not being used at all, then that would not be a religious purpose.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
You said something at the end of your testimony that caught my ear. It sounded like you were saying you thought there was a means by which an organization could evade the 5-year holding period. That right now, as I read this bill, it seems to say only for land or buildings owned as of last January, or for property that they've held for 5 years. So if they didn't own the property last January, my assumption, my reading was that they could purchase it in February, say, and hold it until 2030, and then be eligible for becoming tax exempt. But it sounded like you were saying you thought there was a means by which they could evade that 5-year thing. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. What the changes to the statute are proposed to make is, one is instead of just having a church parsonage occupied by their pastor, but it could also include designated church employees. And so the concern is that 5-year requirement would not apply to housing for designated church employees. And as I indicated, that is a very broad term, and it's unclear who would be eligible for that exemption, but it could be potentially anybody affiliated with the church that's designated a church employee.
So, if I may, Mr. Chairman, one more follow-up. So I think someone else did this and I forget who, but you're essentially saying the, in part one of this bill, that there are really two sections as you're reading it. The first section seems to apply to church employees. And the second section you feel does not, so that the 5-year rule wouldn't apply to property purchased for the intention of housing a church employee. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. And also the 5-year requirement would not apply to property purchased for residential programs.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Hearing none. Thank you very much for your testimony, and please watch the calendar.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Attorney Hyatt, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Ian Hewitt, attorney for Cornerstone. Cornerstone is New Hampshire's only full-time Christian advocacy organization. We represent over 100 churches around the state, so I hope I can help resolve some confusion. This bill, in its as introduced form, we supported, and it is currently close in its wording to something that we would endorse. And we also agreed to a number of compromises in the Senate that would have pushed it over the line into something that we could support. And I hope that we can resolve that in this committee. I will say one thing I really appreciated about Senator Lang's testimony is he clearly articulated that when churches are engaged in activity to support their communities, that is not somehow a secular or a non-religious activity. That's part of the core essence of Christianity for 2,000 years. And although we are only a Christian organization, when it comes to issues of tax assessments and zoning, we typically also are aligned with smaller non-Christian organizations and denominations around the state, as we were when we supported the passage of 674-76. In now Governor Ayotte's stated policies during her campaign, she campaigned on, as part of her written housing plan, one way that we should increase the housing supply in the state is by enabling and encouraging churches to provide more housing. And that was part of the original intent of this bill, and it's a part of the intent of the bill that we support. And we think there's a democratic mandate for enabling churches to contribute to the housing supply. Now, that involves kind of two aspects that are implied in this bill. One is removing negative obstacles that are incapacitating churches from providing housing and other community services. And then one is providing some positive incentive or encouragement for churches to contribute to the housing supply. Now, on the first facet, removing negative obstacles, our churches around the state are running up against increasingly enterprising or aggressive or discriminatory tax assessors and zoning authorities. Churches have always had problems in this area, but we're hearing all over the state that tax assessors in particular are getting more and more enterprising in what they try to count as a secular or a non-religious use. The attorney from Concord stated that tax assessors are giving churches the benefit of the doubt in the area of tax assessment. I don't think I've talked to a single pastor of any kind of Christian denomination anywhere in the state that has said to me, I'm being given the benefit of the doubt. What we're seeing is assessors are trying to tax the grass around the chapel building as a non-religious use. They're trying to tax the outbuildings that are on the same lot but aren't part of the chapel, as that's somehow non-religious or secular. Churches have property on their church lot that they're using for community-oriented programs to give back to their town. That's being assessed as non-religious. And so the result is many of our most enterprising churches in the state, the churches that would like to do things like contribute to the housing supply, are being incapacitated by getting tied up in litigation or disputes around tax assessments or zoning, such that, for example, one of our best, most model churches in the state, Crossing Life in Wyndham, had a school for a couple of years that educated 100 some people, including dozens of people in the community that were there on scholarships. So Crossing Life was saving the town, not getting a subsidy from the town, but saving the town thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in per pupil cost. And they had to close that because of the expense of dealing with assessments and zoning issues from the town, which was getting increasingly aggressive. And then, of course, we have part of the reason that 67476 exists is that we have some towns that have denied all construction of or by churches for 50, 60 years. Now, on the affirmative incentives issue, this is where the 6-unit limitation comes in. This originally had no 6-unit limitation, and we would certainly like to see no limitation. We don't think there needs to be one, but we tried to, on behalf of our churches, negotiate a number of compromises that would at least substantially move the ball forward. 6 is just too low for us to see any of our churches really make any substantial contribution towards housing. You're not going to see any churches say it's time to step up and to provide some more housing with a 6-unit limitation. If it was substantially higher, you would frankly only see a handful of churches, but they're some of the most enterprising entrepreneurial churches. And this is the last point I'll make, these are the kinds of churches that want to reinvest in their communities. The kinds of churches that will provide housing under this bill are churches that are going to give back to their communities with schools, with other community-oriented programs, such that these communities are going to receive a net benefit. And that's why these churches should not be compared to purely commercial landlords, which will just keep the money and will not reinvest that money in their communities. And I'd be happy to take any legal questions about this bill, the as introduced bill, the history of the bill, or any of the text here.
Thank you very much. Before I take questions from the committee, is it your contention that if that 6 number was released, someone like the Salvation Army could establish a homeless shelter, providing either temporary or long-term TANF type housing, and do that without a tax burden for the structure in which families are living as they get reorganized? Is that the position of Cornerstone?
That would certainly be part of what would be included in this bill. And I want to draw your attention to something that the attorney from Concord noted, which is in response to a similar question from you, Mr. Chairman, she said something to the effect of that church should set up a 501c3 and then under an earlier tax exemption in RSA 72, then that property would be totally tax exempt. And what I want to emphasize is I think that actually underscores that our current law, or a really restrictive limitation like a 6-unit limitation, is discriminatory towards churches, because what is being said there is in effect a regular old nonprofit. If it was providing housing as part of the mission of the nonprofit under an earlier provision in RSA 72, that would be totally tax exempt. But if a church provides that service as a church, that's somehow not going to be tax exempt because a church is the service providing it. So churches are right now being treated different and more harshly than other non-church nonprofits. We think that's unconstitutional, and there's a compelling litigation case there, especially under New Hampshire state law. But we hope we can at least substantially move the ball forward with a bill like this one.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the committee? Representative Almy.
Yes. If I'm doing several things with my property and they require separate permits, which is what you're claiming, I think you're getting into an area where a permit for increasing housing is different from a permit for a church, which is on trying to increase housing. But a church is one thing, increasing housing is another thing, even if you regard it as a religious obligation. A land trust regards it as a different kind of obligation, which is to take care of the poor without regard to religion. So you really think that churches should automatically have the same, it wouldn't even be the same classification, because I believe that my land trust has to pay property tax on buildings that we build.
Well,
Maybe she should find out.
Representative, thank you for your question. Just to clarify, we are not saying that there shouldn't be any hurdles that churches should have to jump through if they construct housing on their lot. They would still have to comply with all of the zoning hurdles listed here in lines 72 through 24. And in fact, we're adding an additional hurdle here by pointing to compliance with the sewage system. Now, part of the reason compliance with the sewage system is in here is that a principal talking point from municipalities that are anti-church construction is, well, under this current RSA 674-76, which was enacted last session, now there's difficulties with sewage. So we just want to take that talking point off the table and concede churches need to be required to comply with the same sewage requirements as secular entities. But the reason that this RSA is here is Mr. Deshays from the Municipal Association said, well, the other requirements under zoning are reasonable. There are municipalities in the state that have denied every single, not just housing, but everything, every single thing any church in their town has tried to construct for many, many decades, 50, 60 years, and they always find some different excuse. So the question I would ask as far as Section 76 is it reasonable to deny absolutely anything that any church wants to construct in your town for a long time? I think the alternative is we enumerate a specific list of requirements to ensure they do have to comply with zoning requirements, but they're enumerated and they're clear, like in these lines 17 through 25.
Representative Orrs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for taking my question. So have you ever heard of the region Myanmar?
I have
Recently suffered an earthquake. Yes. So there's a group called EP4, and they're building religious, let me rephrase that. They're building houses and feeding the poor in that region. Would you consider that to be a non-religious outreach because they're building houses for the poor as well as feeding them? Or how does that align with what you're telling us, that by building houses for the poor, we're helping the poor?
I think that's absolutely correct. Christians have always understood that to be a core part of their mission since the institutional church has existed for 2,000 years. Christians have always run community-oriented programs to serve the poor and to serve people in need. And the kinds of churches that will provide housing under this bill are the same kinds of churches that run housing for people recovering from drug addiction, that run housing for unwed mothers, that provide schools, that provide programs to provide educational services to children in their community. Every single church that's going to take advantage of this to build housing is a church that gives back to their community substantially and therefore wouldn't be receiving any subsidy.
Follow up?
Go ahead.
So, as a born-again, Spirit-filled Christian, though I am not a member of any church or fellowship community, I know the local Chichester Church. My constituents there provide food for the children, which I understand the food served in the cafeteria there often is unedible. Would you consider that a religious activity, providing food to the children of that school?
I absolutely would. A religious and a traditionally Christian activity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a general comment. One of my minors in school was comparative religion. It's not just a Christian. If you take a look at Islam, if you take a look at Judaism, if you take a look at Buddhism, Hinduism, even Shintoism, care for the poor, care for your neighbor is a core principle of almost all religions. But that's neither here nor there. Just adding to the point. Any other questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Elberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When your churches are providing schooling, I assume that the schooling is religion-based.
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
Representative Opal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question, Mr. Hewitt, and you've raised some interesting points. I'm wondering, and I'm not proposing to do this, but I'm wondering how Cornerstone would feel if an amendment were offered that said you can build housing, 6 units or 106 units, but that the rental rate on those has to be would be limited below market rate based on the tax exemption you might receive. Some sort of
Yes.
law that says you can cap the price here.
Yeah.
How would you feel about that?
Thank you for your question. Actually, part of what you're describing is you're describing the as introduced bill. As introduced, this bill actually said that the rent would have to correspond to state statutory workforce housing rent, which is something like needs to be affordable to someone with the median income for a 3-person household in the community. There is a state RSA that defines workforce housing rent. So that the requirement there would have made sure that any rent of any of these properties would have been essentially below market rate. So churches have something of a handicap in terms of what rent they could provide in order to fall under these protections. Now, we would ideally...
Yeah, we're getting into...
One more sentence, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, sir.
I would just say we would ideally like to see no limit, but that was something that we supported as part of an attempt to broker a bipartisan compromise to move the ball forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that discussion we can flesh out when we have a work session. Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anyone else that would like to make some commentary on SB 291? Hearing none, close the public hearing on SB 291. We're late, and I apologize to the 2 senators, but I've been to a couple of Senate hearings and I've been late. They've been late too, so that's where we are. I would like now to open the public hearing on
249.
240. I'm just waiting for my clerk to get his act together. He's got a good one. All right. So since Senator Birdsdale is sitting down, I'll call Senator Rosenwald.
She's not the prime sponsor.
Okay, guys. Thank you, Senator. Please introduce the bill. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee, for hearing Senate Bill 249. For the record, my name is Regina Birdsell. I'm the state senator for District 19, which encompasses the towns of Derry, Hampstead, and Windham. And I am the prime sponsor of 249. We're calling it the Met Dish Bill. So I will try and be quick with this because I know you are running behind, and this is the bill right before lunch. So, and then I know the Hospital Association is here to answer any questions you may have. But what is MET? MET stands for Medicaid Enhancement Tax. The MET is a 5.4% tax upon the net patient services revenue of certain hospitals for each hospital's fiscal year ending the calendar year in which the taxable period begins. The MET revenues for fiscal year 2024 totaled $319.2 million. And who pays the MET? The tax is paid by general hospitals required to be licensed under RSA 151 that provide inpatient and outpatient hospital services. The tax is not paid by government facilities or rehabilitation hospitals by statute. And what is DISH? DISH stands for Disproportionate Share Hospital Payments. These are payments for hospitals' uncompensated care made by the Department of Health and Human Services to hospitals that do not meet the definition of critical care access hospitals, but provide essential access to hospital services. DISH payments were determined via an amendment to the New Hampshire Medicaid state plan each year. The Met revenue is deposited into an uncompensated care and Medicaid fund, which is used by DHHS to generate federal match on hospital payments. The federal match for DISH payments is 50% and is up to 90% for rates and directed payments. How do Met and DISH work together? Hospitals are required to pay the 5.4% tax on the net patient services revenue. The tax revenue is then collected, and a total of funds, state and federal equivalent percentage, historically has been 91%, but is currently at 80%, is paid to the hospitals via enhanced inpatient rates, directed payments, and DISH payments to only non-critical access hospitals. So what is the history of Met-DISH? When Met-DISH first began, the state levied a 6% tax on hospitals' gross patient service revenue at all 28 New Hampshire hospitals. At the time, every state was designated a disproportionate share hospital, and so when the hospitals would make their Met payment, the state would refund the identical amount to the hospital under the DISH program. Federal law now prohibits arrangements that guarantee a full refund of a hospital's Met payment. And then the state would then deposit the 50% reimbursement they got from the federal government to our general funds. This allowed the state to generate revenue at a net loss to the hospitals. Via pressure from the feds, eventually the tax was changed to a net patient service revenue, decreasing the amount the state would receive overall. Through action by the legislature in the early 2010s, hospitals were no longer guaranteed a full refund of their Met payment through DISH, and the Met instead became a true tax, which is with a much smaller percentage to the hospitals. This led to numerous New Hampshire hospitals to sue the state, which ended in a 2018 settlement that ensured 91% of the tax hospitals pay through Met would be returned to them. So where do we stand now? The 2018 settlement expired on June 30th, 2024. Last year, the negotiations fell through to make changes to Met-DISH during the session. In July of 2024, Governor Sununu ordered the Commissioner of DHHS to reduce payments back to hospitals from 91% to the 80%. The number agreed in our 2018 lawsuit. What you have in front of you is, originally we mirrored the governor's 80% payment in DISH, and on the floor we amended it to the 91 to match former Senate President Jeb Bradley's bill that we tried to put through in the Committee of Conference, and what the hospitals were getting paid previous in our agreement. So that's a little bit of the history of Met-DISH, and that's about as much as I know. It's a very complicated issue, so I know Senator Rosenwald is here. She has some history of it, as does the Hospital Association.
Will you take questions, Senator?
If I can, I will. If not, I'll refer into the Hospital Association.
That's probably a good idea. Seeing no questions, thank you very much, Senator. Senator Rosenwald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm State Senator Cindy Rosenwald from Nashua, which is District 13. And I think that I have the Senate's longest history on this issue. I'm here really to support this bill and the good work that Senator Birdsall did. I'd like to just highlight a couple of other things that 2019 settlement did. As you probably know, we have two categories of hospitals: critical access, which are the small ones, like the one in Claremont, and the larger ones, which are like CMC, Elliott St. Joe's, Southern, Concord, Dartmouth. And that settlement guaranteed that the critical access hospitals got 75% of their uncompensated care back. And the larger hospitals, the prospective payment system hospitals, got sort of the balance of the 91%. So when the agreement expired in June and Governor Sununu directed the department to return 80% of the med revenues back to the hospitals, we also did something else, which was to change the payment methodology from mostly disproportionate share to Medicaid directed payments, which essentially would give money back to a hospital based on how much Medicaid services it delivered. But why this was really good is that it brings in a much higher match of federal funds to the state. So instead of 50-50, it goes to something like a 65% federal match. It's matched, well, differently. So there's more federal matching funds. And since they're directed to Medicaid provider payments, that offsets the general funds that we would have to appropriate to pay our Medicaid claims. I think you probably know that $348 million was projected in January to be the tax payments that the hospitals were going to pay. What was in the budget for this year was about $337 million. So they were going to pay more than we expected. We did not collect all of those tax payments April 15th. So what happens in May when we're supposed to draw down federal funds and return the payments to hospitals is anybody's guess, because we have been sued, and I'm sure the hospitals will talk about that. I'd be happy to try to answer questions.
Thank you, Senator. Before the committee has any questions, you talked about critical care, but my understanding from previous testimony and your experience, because of your family and et cetera, a good chunk of the emergency services are not emergency services, rather they're urgent care. How does that balance out? Is it considered critical care, or is it considered, I mean, somebody with poison ivy walking into the emergency room is a very expensive calamine lotion treatment.
Well, are you talking about the critical access hospitals?
Yes, please.
Okay, that's a special designation, a federal designation of a type of hospital. It can't have more than 25 beds. And it's basically, I think, about 45 minutes from the nearest hospital. Half of our hospitals are those. They're in basically Peterborough, New London, Claremont. There's one in Lebanon, Alice Peck Day. And then all the ones that are in the North Country. Everything basically from Concord south is a prospective payment system hospital. And the federal government reimburses differently from those two types of hospitals. So it's not really about the kind of care you get. It's what kind of hospital you are.
Okay, thank you. And then the other for the overutilization of St. Joe's or CMC or Elliott or southern New Hampshire for, like I said, poison ivy. I mean, how does that work into this structure?
So the uncompensated care payments are meant to raise the reimbursement, the under reimbursement that Medicaid provides. So if someone who's a Medicaid beneficiary walks into St. Joe's with a case of poison ivy, under this new system, the hospital will get reimbursed for that. And depending on whether they're a child or someone on Medicaid expansion or someone who's in the breast and cervical cancer program, there's a higher federal match rate.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions of the senator? Yes, Representative Ohm, thank you.
Thank you for being recognized, Mr. Chairman.
I couldn't see you. You're too close.
And I wanted to thank Senator Rosenwald for coming to testify before the committee along with Senator Bertzel. Is it fair to characterize this bill as a bipartisan bill from the Senate coming to the House?
Yes.
Thank you. See no others. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Dan. Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Dan McGuire. I represent the town of Epsom. And I'm essentially here on behalf of the Finance Committee. With all respect to my good friends from Derry and Nashua, I think this bill should be a quick ITL on consent. This is the wrong venue, time, and method for this bill. As you can see from the fiscal note, this is a straightforward spending bill. It would cost the state $19 million a year. So if this were to pass and not be part of the budget, which it isn't at the moment, this is a straight, $38 million drain on the rainy day fund for the next biennium. So in my mind, that's completely inappropriate. The right way for this bill to go forward, if it would be for the Senate to figure out a way to shoehorn it into House Bill 2 and find a matching $38 million worth of increased taxes or cuts or something elsewhere to match it, right? But as it is, it's just spending. That's all it is. And I'm happy to take questions.
Representative Almy.
Thank you. As I understand it, the hospitals have filed suit because they agree with large parts of this bill, but they want a different distribution system. And that a number of them have not paid by April 15th the amount of money that they need to pay in order for this system with DC to work, which is something we've been dealing with now for longer than I've been in the legislature. Let's put it like this. It was a scam, which we weren't allowed to call it a scam when I arrived, and getting more money out of the feds. So if we were to kill this bill and not help the Senate figure out how to make this work in a way that the hospitals will participate, they will still, a number of them, be withholding their money. And what happens next?
Thank you for the question. So when you're talking about lawsuits and serious matters like that,
I think our governor has a lot of experience in this area. The governor did not put the 91% into the budget. The governor put 80% into the budget. That's the number I'm talking about. It's line 2 on page 1. Oh, sorry, line 20 on page 1 at the end of the line. That's the key. Right? That's the key number in this whole thing. It's the source of the $38 million cost. So the governor put in 80%. The House put in 80%. Anybody can sue on, for whatever reason, and they can figure that out in court or by settlement. So to me, that's a separate issue. The question is, this is a straightforward, again, this is just taking money away from the state that we haven't budgeted. I mean, it's that simple. And we can budget it. They can put it in House Bill 2, and then we can talk about it, right? But we have to see what balances it. If you want to pass this, then, come up with a matching $38 million of more taxes or something, right? So, and I don't think we want to do that in this way. We want to do it as part of a comprehensive budget, because the budget is a trade-off between this kind of spending and every other kind of spending, right? And to just sort of decide we want to do this spending on its own, that's just, we don't do things that way. It's just silly.
Follow up, ma'am.
Yes, 2. One, I don't believe that the hospitals had a say in that 80%, and neither did the legislature. It was done by the governor, and is being continued by this governor, plus now your budget. But the Senate is, from my understanding, going to be changing that budget a fair amount. And I'm not sure where they get their money from. But
Representative Holman, we're getting into speculation and need a direct question and a direct on the bill.
On the bill. And the bill, I believe, is an important step towards reaching agreement between all parties, rather than leaving it to a committee of conference at the end, which is going to have an awful lot of issues to discuss. Thank you.
So just with regard to the process of creating the budget, this is not a trivial amount of money. This is not a trivial item as far as Division 3 is concerned, which is the part of House Finance that deals with the HHS budget. And so, and I'm sure that our Division 3 chairman and other members have spoken to the hospitals in the course of creating the budget. So this is not somehow, an overlooked item or something like that. It's part of a deliberate process. And so, they could have decided to go with this kind of thing or not.
Thank you. Representative Ohm.
Yes, thank you, Representative McGuire, and thank you so much for your hard work on finance as vice chair, taking all the heat on all the tough decisions. So I wanted to get back to the process on this.
That's why I get the big bucks. Anyway, sorry.
And I'm confused by the process as you are. It seemed to me that the House had looked at this as part of their budgeting process and came up with the number. And now we're getting a workaround coming to Ways and Means to look at a different number. Shouldn't this bill be run through Senate Finance and then come back? Because I just wonder if it's worth the effort by us in Ways and Means to redo all the testimony that you've heard and come up with a different number that's not funded. So am I wrong by saying we should just retain this bill and see what comes out of House, what comes out of Senate Finance for funding?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Are you sure you mean Senate Finance and not House Finance?
Well, yeah, Senate Finance now has the budget that you passed over to them. And if Senate wants this bill, shouldn't Senate Finance fund this bill?
Yes. Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. If you want to retain it, that's fine by me. And then Senate Finance can take the initiative to put it into House Bill 2, and we'll go from there. Yes. I believe that House Division 3 decided to accept, it's true the governor put in the 80% at the beginning, right? But the House Division 3 didn't see any reason to change it, right? So they did make a decision in that way.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So was there any important testimony in the House hearings on this topic that we need to know about?
Yeah, thank you for the question, but I'm unaware of that. So I don't remember. I mean, we did have a public hearing on House Bill 2, and it was 6 hours long. So whether there was testimony or not on this particular topic, I don't think so. But also I'm a member. I'm not in Division 3. I'm in Division 1. So whatever. I'm not aware of whether they had this, how much time they spent on this particular issue.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, Representative. Appreciate the input.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll now call Mr. Journet and Mr. Berry.
Good morning. For the record, I'm David Chorney, the state's Deputy Medicaid Director.
And I'm Rob Berry, General Counsel to the Division of Medicaid.
Thank you.
No problem. So we're here to provide some information around SB 249 and specifically around some of the revenue projections included in the bill. So the first piece I would point out is that SB 249 establishes the hospital payment pool based off of the Met revenue collected in the prior state fiscal year. So for 26, the payment pool would be based off of the Met collected in state fiscal year 25, and based on the non-binding estimate, that's a revenue estimate of $348 million. And the governor has proposed a pool for state fiscal year of 25 that would increase from 80% to 87%. And there's a way to implement that plan in state fiscal year 26 and 27 in accordance with this legislation that would create an effective rate of total dollars of 91%, which is $317 million of the 348. And I think you heard from Senator Rosenwald about the differing match rates between disproportionate share hospital payments, Medicaid service rates, and to better leverage federal funds under the governor's proposal, it increases the size of the pool from the 80% plan to $317 million for state fiscal year 26, while mitigating the impact to the state budget by leveraging enhanced federal match through Medicaid service rates and sharing that enhanced federal match with the hospitals, and being able to maintain the leftover remaining balance of Met for other provider payments within the Medicaid budget. We would want to reserve the right to be able to update the agency budget if this legislation were passed, so that the numbers are consistent, because the agency budget is built off the 80% proposal. And then the other piece of information I would point out is that the legislation is effectively a 2-year deal. So state fiscal year 26 and 27, I think it's repealed automatically on July 1 of 2027. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that proposal, given the uncertainty around federal legislation that could impact Medicaid funding, whether it be a change in the match rates. There's a federal proposal that would decrease the amount of Medicaid enhancement tax we could collect It's currently 5.4%. There's some federal proposals to drop it down to 5% or lower. And so it gives the flexibility with the uncertainties at the federal level to be able to implement a hospital payment pool that grows the pool from the current projection of 80% to a larger number at 91% while mitigating impacts to the state budget. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Representative Ohm wants to speak again.
That's been so long. Yeah, thank you for coming to give us some expertise on this whole topic. I'm looking at your physical note at the back of the handout, and this is being the tax committee, we're always worried about finding money to pay for programs. And the note on this bill indicates a cost of approximately $19 million per fiscal year in general state funds. Is that your current assessment of the cost of this bill? And is there any advice you would have on how to take that number down to zero?
So thank you for the question. That projection is based off of using the same payment mechanisms for state fiscal year 25 and state fiscal year 26. So the 80% proposal has about $110 million paid out through disproportionate share hospital payments. To mitigate that $19 million amount, it would be to transition DSH payments into Medicaid service rate payments, which garner a higher federal match, and then share that enhanced federal match back with the hospitals. So in effect, you're growing the pool, but using the same state portion of dollars to. Yep.
Follow up?
Yeah, thank you. So do you have any specific language or any specific updates to the analysis? I guess specific language is what I'd be interested in. Do we need to take something on this current proposal from the Senate, which is a nice bipartisan proposal, but it comes $19 million short? Do we have any specific language we could use to amend this bill to take that deficit down to zero?
We can take it back and certainly look at it. I think the legislation currently as drafted, I know, does give flexibility to the state to determine the payment mechanisms in collaboration with the hospitals. And so I think what I'm hearing is you'd want amendment language to sort of codify the idea that we would leverage federal match dollars to the greatest extent possible.
Another follow-up.
Yeah, so if I may, I would suggest the goal of the committee is to not raise taxes. And if there's some other way to solve this important need without raising taxes, we would like to hear those proposals. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Schaumburg.
Thank you,
for
Mr.
your
Chairman.
patience.
I have two questions, really. You mentioned right at the beginning, you said something like 80% to 87%. Did you mention that in your opening statement there? I'm trying to understand what it meant.
Oh, yep. So historically, the percentage was 91%. When the legislation didn't pass last year at the committee of conference, the governor directed the department to reduce hospital payments to 80%. Governor Ayotte for state fiscal year has proposed 87%.
Okay, that answers that one.
with this week.
Now for council, Mr. Chairman. Follow up to council. Thank you. If Medicaid is cut immediately by some action not in the state without a new federal budget, what would council be able to do? Would it have to go to the governor to discuss this issue of how we're going to finish paying out our Medicaid this year?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a very big question to answer, and what that would entail is it would be a collaboration within the department, the governor's office, and the other relevant parties to determine the next best steps there.
Kind of beyond our scope, though. Well, yeah, I know. Are there any further questions from the committee?
Just one thing, if you don't.
If I could ask one question. When you say 80%, 91%, you're talking about of federal funds, correct?
It would be total funds. So the hospital payments are a portion of state funds, which is supported by the MET revenue, the Medicaid enhancement tax revenue, which is then leveraged for federal funds to support hospital payments. So under the plan, when the hospitals are paid 91% of the MET, it's not MET dollars coming in and MET dollars going back. It's encompasses of the state share and the federal share once we garner the federal match.
So if you were to provide any suggested language to this committee, that would need to be spelled out A, B. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And yes, Representative Opal.
One last question, just to follow up on what Representative Schamberg was saying. I'm trying to do the math here. Help me, because I was an English major, not a. So the Met revenues, 348.3 million. And I get the 91% and the 80%. That was done in the fiscal note. But you're saying the governor proposed 87%?
For state fiscal year 25, and this legislation, I believe, only pertains to 26 and
Okay.
27.
I was just, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Mr. Honor, is that an H or a B? H. So I got it. Thank you. Wow.
Still good morning. So good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Steve Annan. I am the president of the New Hampshire Hospital Association. I'm here representing all 26 of our community hospitals as well as our specialty hospitals. We appreciate Senator Birdsall's introduction of Senate Bill 249, as well as the Senate's move to bring this bill closer to where we think we can support it at 91% more closely aligned with the historical trends. We view this as a work in progress, and we look forward to working with the House to come up with a fair and reasonable solution. So I have testimony, I'll hand that in, and I apologize. I want to just kind of cover a number of things. For decades, New Hampshire hospitals have worked hard to support the state's Medicaid program, and the Medicaid enhancement tax is one way that we do that, and it's relatively simple. Hospitals agree to pay an assessment. You've heard it, 5.4% of net patient service revenue, which is essentially the net of what they're paid to care for patients. And they do that, and when they do that, the state receives federal matching dollars. In 2025, hospitals anticipate paying $348 million in Medicaid enhancement tax revenue. When that is matched, it is more than doubled to support the Medicaid program. And I just want to be clear, 91% of what the hospitals pay comes back to them. Not hospital X pays something and they get 91% back, somebody else get 91% back. It's 91% in the aggregate. And it's based upon a number of factors: Medicaid services that they provide, uncompensated care levels that they provide, and that is what comes back. So 91% of what they paid comes back to them. That other 9%, as well as all of the federal match on all of that, comes back to the state and supports the state's Medicaid program, pays to fund the managed care organizations, supports critical services like behavioral health, substance use, and others. But again, to be clear, hospitals lose money serving Medicaid patients. We're simply trying to do so and to do less. We don't have a Medicaid healthcare system. We don't have a Medicare healthcare system. We don't have a private health insurance system. We don't have an uninsured healthcare system. We have a healthcare system that serves all of those patients. And as hospitals work to do that, all of those revenues that come in supports care for all of those individuals. As you heard earlier, the state has gone through a number of iterations regarding the Medicaid enhancement tax and DSH program. Back in 2010 was the first year that it became a real tax. Hospitals were paying the tax and they were getting back something different than what they paid. It was no longer a hold harmless federal government would no longer allow that. Some hospitals paid more in taxes than they got back, some paid less and got more. As a result of budget action in about 14 years ago, the larger hospitals got nothing back as part of their dish payments. The small hospitals continued to get dish payments. The large hospitals paid a tax. They got nothing back. At that time, we had a couple of different lawsuits that were brought forward challenging the constitutionality of the MET, and two superior courts ruled that the MET was unconstitutional. Well, why is that? It's because hospitals provide services to patients, and so do other non-hospital providers. So an ambulatory surgical center, an imaging center, testing lab, they provide those same services, but because they're not affiliated with a hospital, they don't pay the Medicaid enhancement tax. Superior Court judge, two Superior Court judges found that to be unconstitutional, treating two similarly situated taxpayers differently. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on television. But those two cases were decided. And at the time, hospitals in the state sat down and said, let's figure out a solution. Let's work together to solve this problem because it's critical for the funding of New Hampshire's Medicaid program. So hospitals in the state, we did that. We partnered together, provided predictable, stable revenue for the state, provided stable, predictable revenue for the hospitals, and most importantly, ensured access to care for patients all across the state. Hospitals were willing to pay that tax so long as the reimbursements coming back were fair and reasonable. We weren't looking for a windfall. We just wanted fair and reasonable payments. As you've heard, we've been negotiating to try and find a fair and reasonable solution. Representative Ohm, we've been working in the Senate over the last several months. I wish we had gotten further and more quickly, but it took some time. And so we're now here in the House. And we look forward to the opportunity to work with all of you. We've heard that the governor's budget put 80% in as what hospitals were going to receive. That was the directive that Governor Sununu gave to the commissioner after negotiations failed last summer during the conference committee. What that means, what 80% means, is a net loss of for hospitals across the state of $70 million. For our 13 largest hospitals, it's roughly $100 million that they would lose as a result of this change. That's simply unacceptable. It's a tax increase. We're increasing taxes. When government keeps more of your money, that's a tax increase, and that's what's happening. And it shouldn't happen here. We've heard about the change in distribution methodology, moving from dish to directed payments and rates. We think that's a good idea because, as you heard, it brings in additional federal matching dollars. So every dollar that the state of New Hampshire puts forward, and I'll just remind you again, those dollars are supplied by the hospitals when they pay the Medicaid enhancement tax. Every dollar brings back additional federal matching funds to support the state's Medicaid program. That's a good thing. It supports hospitals, but it supports all kinds of services across the spectrum. Mental health, substance use, community health centers, community mental health centers, and the like. But understand that the change in methodology, the state is benefiting tremendously from this change. Under the modeling at 80%, we view that the state is generating about $137 million more for itself than they did under the prior agreement. And hospitals are losing $70 million. That's not a fair and reasonable solution. And we think we can do better, and we think we need to do better. And again, all of this comes at a time when hospitals continue to struggle financially. We had a negative 0.4% operating margin across all of our not-for-profit hospitals last year at a time when hospitals continue to see increased demand. We have workforce shortages, and we struggle getting patients out of the hospital who no longer need inpatient level of care. But because we can't get them to the nursing home or to other settings, we struggle to take care of those patients and then take care of all the other patients who are trying to get into the hospital. As I said, hospitals have offered a number of proposals that we believe are fair and reasonable, that generates more money significantly more revenue for the state than it's ever received before, and to do so in a way that supports our hospitals. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm going to end where I started. We look forward to the opportunity to work with you to solve this problem in a fair and responsible manner. We think that's good for New Hampshire, we think that's good for the state budget, and we think it's good for providers, and most importantly, it's good for our patients. Thank you.
Thank you. Will you take questions?
I would, of course, do that.
Representative Ohm.
Thank you. Thank you for your compelling testimony. I appreciate particularly the work of the nonprofit hospitals. I live in Nashua. We have St. Joseph is a wonderful hospital that we rely on quite heavily. You mentioned that you're looking at some fair and reasonable arrangements. I think I'd like to ask you the same question I asked to the HHS people. Do you have any language that you would consider fair and reasonable that would eliminate the need for general funding that you could live with? And if so, could you provide that to us?
We believe that the bill that came out of the Senate is a dramatic step in the right direction. We're getting closer to where we need to be. But even at 91%, we still have significant losses among hospitals. And we think that there's an opportunity to do a little bit better. The proposal that we were looking at last summer during the conference committee, we referred to as using a little bit of that additional federal match that's coming in to increase some of those payments to hospitals. We think, again, hospitals will still lose money at the end of the day under what we call a fair and reasonable solution. We're simply trying to lose less and to do so in a way that hospitals can manage. And I want to be clear on this. You know, hospitals have been working together to solve this problem. It's not critical access hospitals versus the larger hospitals, southern versus the northern hospitals, because our critical access hospitals, we want to protect them. We want to help make sure that they're taken care of, because their revenues are much tighter than everyone else's. But simply solving their problem doesn't, at the expense of the larger hospitals, doesn't help them, because at the end of the day, when they have a patient who needs a higher level of care and they need to transfer them to one of our larger centers, the academic medical center, one of the larger hospitals, and those hospitals are unable to accept them, that doesn't help those hospitals. That certainly doesn't help those patients. So we've got to find a way to do this that all hospitals can support. And the last thing I'll say, you know, we learned a lot during the pandemic, but one of the things that we learned very clearly was when one of our hospitals is struggling or in distress, everybody is in distress, and we have to find a way to work together to solve those. So to answer your question, you know, what I would say is we need to do a little bit better than 91%. And by doing that, by bringing in some of those federal dollars, those additional federal dollars, we think that that is a solution that gets us to where we need to go. And then the last thing I'll just say is, again, I just want to remind everyone, the $348 million of Met revenue is paid by the hospitals. That $348 million, if the Superior Courts find that tax to be unconstitutional again, that $348 million would be uncollectible. And the legislature would have to look someplace else to find $348 million to generate over $400 million of federal matching revenue. So while I understand the challenge that you identified, Representative, it's a much bigger problem if litigation shows that that tax is unconstitutional.
Representative Spar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You just answered a couple of the questions I had. So the 348 million that we send down to the Fed, basically, what we get back is 400. So there's it's
a little, it's about 400 and about $485 million would come back as a result of the change in methodology. So again, that's about $137 million more than the state received under last year's agreement.
Just to follow up with that, sir. If the Fed did then drop the reimbursement back to essentially 100% of what we send down there, then essentially this would be a moot issue? Well, we wouldn't need to tax?
Well, as Deputy Director Chorney mentioned, there are a number of things that are being considered in Washington that could have an impact on this. One of which is the percentage of the tax that can be applied to hospitals and other providers. Currently, the maximum amount is 6%. New Hampshire is at 5.4%. There are proposals that would drop it somewhere between 5.5 to 5, some even lower. If that were the case, we would certainly be unable to generate matching funds off of all of that 348 million. But also, because of the enhanced match, that comes from the fact that New Hampshire is a Medicaid expansion state, as well as participation in the CHIP program. If Medicaid expansion were to go away, or if that were to drop below 90%, that would have an impact on what those, what that matching fund would be. So again, all very complicated, but those are questions that are happening in Washington that I can't answer exactly how they will turn out.
Representative Ohm?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to talk about the timeline that we have on the committee here. It's a bill probably going to go to a second committee. We have to get all our bills out by the end of May. Do you feel you have time to continue negotiations in this window to come up with an amendment that would allow us to not come up with additional general funds for the budget? And I say that because we can all save a lot of money if we take away the lawyers. It saves both parties quite a bit of money. So I'm hoping that we are in the negotiating range and we have a negotiating window to resolve this. And what we can offer you, speaking only for myself, but I suggest that to the committee as well, we can offer you is a vehicle to get a negotiated settlement in place under state law on a timely basis, if that can be accomplished. So I hope you would expedite whatever you can. Thank you.
I would just say we continue to be, prepared and ready to negotiate a settlement that is fair and reasonable, that works for everyone. We continue to have those conversations, and I'm hopeful, always hopeful, that we'll get to a better resolution in the end. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Hearing none, thank you very much, sir. Representative Ohm, if we're going to talk about getting rid of lawyers, we'll leave that to Representative Opal. He's the English teacher. I enjoyed that, but I will call Mr. Hood to the thing. And do you support or oppose this bill?
I think the bill moves in the right direction, and so for the record, my name is Matthew Hood. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for Dartmouth Health. Dartmouth Health is an umbrella organization that includes the Medical Center in Lebanon. It includes critical access hospitals like Alice Peck Day and New London Hospital, as well as Valley Regional Hospital and Cheshire Medical Center. So to answer your question, I appreciate the opportunity to testify regarding SB 249. And I'm appreciative of the Senate's efforts to move this forward at a level of the 91%. I still think there's more work to do on the bill and to reach a type of resolution that Mr. Anand discussed, but I think it's a step in the right direction. What I'd like to do, if I can, is I don't know that I could add anything new to what you've already heard about the structure of the Medicaid enhancement tax and the operation of it. But I did want to give Dartmouth Health's perspective and what are the concerns that we have with even this bill, SB 249. They really fall in two buckets. One is the size of the pool, and the other is the distribution methodology of that pool. With respect to the size of the pool, you've already heard that what revenue this generates for the state of New Hampshire's Medicaid program. I would just note that of the 348 million of MET that's generated by the hospitals, Dartmouth Health members contribute 105 million of that pool. So it's a fairly large, it's just under a third of the entire size of the pool. Part of the pool is returned to hospitals to help defray the amount of uncompensated care provided. Again, free and reduced care, yes, but also the under reimbursement on Medicaid. Since the total UCC, uncompensated care that hospitals provide, is so much larger than the availability of the DISH pool, as Mr. Anand stole my line, we're not trying to make money here, we're trying to lose less money in terms of how the Met DISH deal is structured. You've already heard the history of the 91% being reduced to 80%, the governor's budget, the House's budget. I was glad that Mr. Chorney mentioned the 87% proposal that the governor has made, and we are looking forward to those conversations continuing and negotiations and discussions. Again, because it's not just about the size of the pool, it's about the distribution methodology. We would, if it were 80%, Dartmouth Health would, the academic medical center alone would lose $27 million compared to last year. We would lose as a system upwards of $31 million for all system members. A loss of that amount year over year, coupled with the proposed 3% Medicaid cut, coupled with, I heard a question about the federal level activity, they're quite concerning to us, and it's going to make us do some contingency planning for the level of services that we can provide. I apologize for not turning my head over this direction as well. What level of services can we provide, and what does it mean we have to cut back on if there's $30 million less annually that we have? We're going to provide care to everybody who needs it, regardless of the ability to pay. That's our mission. I want to be really clear about that. But we also engage in a tremendous amount of community activity to outreach to patients, right? As we live in a rural population in the Upper Valley and the northern part of the state, we try to do outreach to those patients. If those dollars go away, what it likely means is we contract a little bit. We pull back and we make people come to us as opposed to going out to them in satellite locations. It means maybe we can't invest in workforce enough. There was a question about costs. Workforce is by far the most expensive component of our operations, and they are far exceeding their budgeted levels. We are at the moment, for the current 9 months fiscal year, at a 1.4% operating margin. We suspect that that is going to slip as we get through the rest of the year to closer to a break-even point. Part of that is having taken on the contract at Hampstead Hospital to provide care for the children there, and taken that 23 million or so off of the state's books. I can't tell you where we're going to land with respect to those service reductions, right? We don't know that because we don't want them to happen. I could just tell you that our ability to meet the needs of the patients in our facilities and the community would be negatively impacted. I'll be very brief as I come to the conclusion here. Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the distribution, there hasn't always been clarity, right, with respect to how the federal match is distributed, because the rules change and the options change year over year. And so now we're talking about things like directed payments. We're talking about things like dish pools, et cetera. It needs to be not just a pool size, but a distribution methodology that acknowledges the uncompensated care that each of the hospitals provides. Under the governor's proposal, depending upon the distribution methodology, and I want to say depending upon the distribution methodology, Dartmouth Health would still pay just under 30% of the Medicaid enhancement tax, but we'd get hit with initially a 70% of the reduction. That's a disproportionate impact that one hospital system I don't think should be asked to bear. In light of these concerns, Dartmouth Health joined the litigation that was referenced, challenging the constitutionality of this tax, and we've withheld our payment. I am hopeful, however, that this committee continues to work on 349, doesn't wait until a committee of conference on HB2, because I think there's a timeliness component here with respect of getting the match from the federal government that has implications for the state's Medicaid program. Also very optimistic, cautiously optimistic about the conversations that have been taking place with the governor's office and sharing information and understanding methodologies and moving in the right direction. So with that, I'll stop. I'll thank you for your attention and take any questions.
Oh, we'll start at that end this time. Every time I start at this end, I get trouble from that end. So we'll try it the other way. Okay. Representative Boers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for taking my question. So how much profit does Dartmouth make a year?
That's what I was trying to point out earlier, sir. Representative. At the 9 months year to date, we are at 1.4% operating margin, which is $35 million.
35 million or billion?
Million.
Million. Thank you.
Yep.
Representative Schomburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Matt, for taking this question. How much would a non-agreement affect your overall staff employment and the effect upon the communities of the workers that would probably have to be relieved?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I tried to paint a little bit of the picture about the contraction that we might be faced with that type of reduction, but I don't want to signal reductions in force. I don't want to signal service lines that will be terminated, because I think we'll do everything in our power to make sure that that doesn't happen, and we'll continue to be able to serve people. I think the issue is multifaceted. There are employment factors that are driving the cost of providing services. There are bottlenecks in our hospital in terms of what's available in the community, post-acute care no longer being necessary. The example that's staggering to me is that of the beds at the medical center, up to 20% of them are occupied by patients who no longer need to be there. And there's just not an option for them in the community anymore. So what that means is, never mind not getting paid for that care, right? Because you're not getting paid for that care. It's more about the availability and the access for the type of high-level acute care that we're there to provide. So instead of coming to the medical center and having a space because of that bottleneck, you're looking at Albany, you're looking at Hartford, Connecticut, you're looking at other places in the New England region to provide care. That situation could be exacerbated, Representative, but I think we would do everything we could do to avoid the questions that you suggested or asked about.
Representative Opal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Hood, taking my question. I'm curious, and I heard some numbers, but I'm curious if you have numbers for this committee, just for Dartmouth Health System, about the scope of uncompensated care that the system provides and the scope of underpayments from Medicaid that you're living with.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, and I was anticipating it, and unfortunately I didn't collect the numbers of uncompensated care that we provide prior to the hearing. I apologize, Representative Opal, but I will make sure that committee gets that information. What I could say is, remember, we're on the medical center's on the border of Vermont, and so roughly 40% of the patients that are served are in the state of Vermont. We pay a Medicaid enhancement tax to the state of New Hampshire for the patients that we serve that come to the medical center from Vermont. Let's remember that. A tax is generated on those folks, and we don't get recognition in the current distribution methodology to those Vermont lives. So that's the issue with the distribution methodology that we're so concerned about making sure is rectified. Doesn't answer your question. In answer to your question, we get paid roughly 40 cents on the dollar from the state of New Hampshire for the Medicaid portfolio that we provide. So say the cost is $100 million, we would get $40 million for that care.
Thank you, sir.
Representative Ohm.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the fact that you don't get the state's share because your Medicaid patients come from Vermont, and that has a penalty on your location, even though you provide important services. I just wanted to reinforce, and being a bit redundant here, that it's very unlikely for this committee to come up with $19 million. And if you'd like to get this settled without as a plaintiff in this lawsuit, if you'd like to get this settled, you have a window here with this committee with a amendment that we could entertain, as long as it doesn't take $19 million out of the general funds. So I hope you're in the negotiating range. I just want to reinforce you have a window here with this committee. If you could come up with a revenue neutral solution, I think we'd love to have that answer, because I don't think you want us to figure this problem out for you. We're just going to screw it up worse. Thank you.
Thank you for the question/observation, Representative. I think there are significant implications for the Medicaid program, and therefore I hope that there's resolution to this. I want to be really clear again. I'm not an attorney for the health system. I'm not an attorney for the New Hampshire Hospital Association. I am a government relations person for Dartmouth Health. So I'm encouraged by my understanding of what's taking place with discussions with the governor's office, but I don't represent, from a legal perspective, those organizations. I just wanted to be really clear about that.
Representative Almy.
Thank you. Given that you have to pay met tax for the Vermonters that come. And because the Vermonters do not have a high-level hospital, except in the extreme west of their state, and given that you don't get reimbursed on the basis of those, if the law was changed so that you were, and I don't know if that involves federal problems, what would that do to the rest of the system, the other hospitals?
Thank you for the question, Representative Almy. What I can say is I understand that CMS does not allow today for the state, one state to reimburse in terms of disproportionate share hospital payments for another state's beneficiaries. So it's an interesting question. It's a bit academic given the current configuration with respect to federal law. I suspect that if DISH or DISH-like payments, right? Because again, there's directed payments, there's supplemental payments. If those payments were available for the Vermont lives, that would dilute the reimbursement that other hospitals in the state received to a degree. What is that degree? I can't answer that question. I know that the Hospital Association and the state have been hard at work to figure out how to recognize that there are hospitals that serve on the border and to recognize that rate reimbursement might be more appropriate to have it elevated for border hospitals. So there's work being done in that space in light of the challenge that the federal law provides.
Thank you. Although that is a bit academic. And Vermont has Burlington, Bennington, Brattleboro, and I believe there's one in Rutland as well.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I just missed what the question.
That's Vermont. That's just a side. It wouldn't have anything to do with you.
I mean, we do have Vermont members, but I didn't think that they were, the committee would be interested in hearing about those. So I kept it to New Hampshire.
Are there any other questions of this witness? Thank you very much for the input, and we look forward to any correspondence you wish to disseminate to the committee.
Thank you again.
Is there anyone else that would like to testify on this bill? Hearing none, I'll call this meeting or this hearing closed. Before the committee gets up and goes around, there are a couple of announcements. Please pay attention. First, the last day to have these drawers over here cleaned out completely and all of your personal equipment removed from this building is the 22nd. So,
And your lockers.
and your lockers downstairs. If you need a locker, please go over and see Paul. He can read. There are some extra lockers available over in the State House.
You know when we're last meeting here?
Yeah, we have another meeting coming up.
No, May 22nd, or is it?
I'm not sure exactly when that is. Pay attention to it.
Okay.
Let me get my calendar out. Yeah, we've got we've got several days available. There'll be a couple more here. Also on May 7th, we have was started by Representative Elberger, and we've got it set up. We get to go gambling if you'd like. Well, no. We have a tour coming up of the Nash. If you would like to go down to that, please contact Jennifer and ask her for, and tell her that you're intending on going. That's on May 7th. The sooner you let her know, the sooner she can let them know, so that if they want to have coffee and cookies, they're available. No alcoholic beverages will be consumed. This is being announced as a public hearing, but no public's going to go unless they tag along behind us. Jennifer, was that 11 o'clock? Thank you. Yeah. Yes, It's about as far away as North People Country can get because you're going literally to the Massachusetts line. Parking is in Massachusetts. Really? Okay, Representative Ohm.
Yeah, I wanted to thank the chair for the junk removal service at no cost. Thank you. Oh, can I bring some other stuff in?
Yeah, the people would like to go to lunch, but go ahead.
So, sir, is there mileage being paid for that since it's a meeting?
We have requested mileage from the speaker's office. We will have the federal sign-ins, particularly for people like you. Me, yes, it is a meeting. Me, I get to lose mileage because it's 2 miles away. No, we're done. We're done today. All right. Thank you, folks.